Hello there, my name is Clark and I'll be discussing the Student Management System application built with Java servlets using MySQL database on the back end. On the front, we're using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and a little bit of jQuery. Okay, so first and foremost, I'd like you to show what the JSON endpoint would look like. If I click here, and this is the data, right? As you can see, it's a list of students with ID number, last name, first name, email, phone, addresses, location, right? And the marks that they got from their subjects. Going back, I can retrieve a student and with their specific JSON endpoint. Let's say I choose this person, hit submit, and I would only get his JSON endpoint. Okay, and this is through the get student controller, which is a servlet. Next thing is we want to insert to the database, right? And before inserting to the database, we want to check if we are basically saving to the local storage or not. Okay, so click here, and as you can see, I do have local storage being set there. Okay, I'm gonna start to add a new student. Okay, so let's go with Bruce Wayne. Quickly type all of these fields, say 89, hardware, say 88, and I click submit. As you can see here now, you would see on the very bottom, you see Bruce Wayne being set in the local storage, as well as I can see a list of the students here, and I can show more details and hide details. As for future implementation, we'll be basically adding the edit button so that we can edit specific fields and make an update to the database. Okay, so we now look into the code base. As you can see, our entry point is the index.jsp, and we have the student management system here. The first link that we did see is the get students, right? It will basically get all the students and put that in a JSON format, right? The next thing is we retrieve a student, and you see this form, right? And we hit the get student endpoint. Inserting a student has the add student. For the list of students, we are basically using a jQuery and Ajax to basically load that. So we can go first with list of students. So it will do this load data on page load JS, and we start with doing an Ajax request, hitting that endpoint, and basically parsing the JSON data, right? To simulate that we can retrieve from the local storage, we can now set the JSON, the stringified JSON data, to the local storage, and then retrieve that again and parse. Okay, we skip here, and this is basically the starting point where we chose the div with this ID my data, and we would basically iterate the students, all the students, and start creating the HTML for each of the student properties or fields, and basically putting them inside the div. Okay, as you can see, those are the other information we have, and then the show more show less is this more.js, where we basically toggle between the display of none for the dots and with the more text for none and inline. Okay, let's go back to the logic. So when we retrieve the all students, we get this endpoint get students, and one thing to note is we would call the student DAO get students, right? And then after we get the list of students, we would use a JSON converter, right? That's why we do get a JSON format, right? So in the student DAO, the logic here is we first count the number of students in the table so that we can now use that later on, right? Next is we get all the students and start building our student object and adding them to the list of students, right? Then we can now, because now we have a student ID, we can now get location, address, and marks for each of the students and map them, right? And we would basically get each location that's available for a student and put that in a locations list, right? And then now once that's complete, for the specific student, we can now set that set the locations and set the addresses and set the marks, right? For retrieving a single student, we would just need the first name, last name, and set those parameters from this controller. We got the request.get parameter, first name and last name, right? And then again, it would do a student DAO, call that method getStudent, and convert that to JSON again, right? And this is the logic for that. Again, we have the first name, last name, and we basically build the student object, and we now have a student ID, and we can now build the location, address, and mark. The last one that we have is the add student. So when we have the add student, we basically get the parameters that were sent from the form, right? And again, call the student DAO. And what we do now is added this set foreign keys checks to 0 to allow manipulation of adding of data in child rows or deleting of data in child rows. And now we do prepare statements for adding a student in a student table. And because now we got that student, we have a student ID, we can now start adding data for the location, address, and marks while mapping the student ID as the foreign key for those respective tables. For the domain, we do have the address, the location, the mark, and the student object. Okay. And lastly, some of the utilities we have is the MySQL data source for our database connection. We have the JSON converter so that we can output JSON data endpoint for other users. And that's basically it. Thank you. This is also to show you how the association between the tables that we have, most of them are going to have a one-to-many relationship coming from the student. And to show you the specific tables that we have the address, we have the location, we have the marks, student, and an example of a join with student, table, and marks.